Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review for Locklands by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the third and final book in the Foundry Side series. While this review is spoiler-free for this book, I will probably be talking about things for the first two books, so I will link my reviews for those on the screen if you want to go check those out and not get spoiled. So this is a series that I wasn't intending on necessarily finishing because I had forgotten how much I liked it, and then a bunch of you were like, no, the finale is really good, whatever. And I read it and I was like, oh my god, that's right, I love this series. I hadn't read the first two books in a while though, so I actually found summaries here on BookTube from a booktuber. I will link their summaries down below for the first and second book. That is like a play-by-play summary, so I didn't feel like I had to reread it, and like they bring in the emotions and what characters possibly thought and whatever. It's perfect if you don't want to do a reread, but you still want all the rereading information. So I will link their videos down below. There's a time jump between the events of the second book and this book. So about 8 years have passed and a ton has happened. And it was actually kind of good for me to go into this book having not read the other books right before, because that passage of time didn't feel like weird or jarring at all. So yeah, it really worked for me, and it really worked for the series, I think, overall. So let's get into it. First off, let me talk about the world building. So this is a series that I classify now as fantasy science. So you know, people talk about the science fantasy genre, like Star Wars, for example, would be considered like science fantasy, Dune, things like that, where it's more of a sci-fi, but there are fantastical elements to how the science works. In this is definitely a fantasy book, but the fantasy is science-y in a way that where the fantasy feels more like tech. So I really like this kind of genre bending thing. If you have other books that you would recommend that are kind of like this, I haven't read anything quite like this. Like some people are like, oh, well maybe like Mistborn, and no, like this is its own kind of thing. So I really like how sort of technical and how it took what would basically be computers and things and like AI and whatever in a sci-fi setting and turn it into a fantasy thing. Very cool. We also get more exploration of the world in here and just like bigger, huge sort of magic concepts and, like I said, different parts of the world and how things work, and sort of the history, and sort of wrapping up, because it's the finale, what all of this like lore and stuff we've been learning about, like what the truth behind that is. And then again, that was really awesome. Next, we'll talk about our characters. I've always really loved the characters in here. We are missing a few because things have happened throughout the series, but even with those absences, it didn't feel like it was empty. I continue to love our main character. I love the sapphic relationship she is in and her partner and their dynamic. Then this story brings in a lot of additional characters and community aspects that I really dug. Kind of this almost utopian feel to it at times that some people might find a little bit cloying, but I quite liked, because it's not utopian in like a Becky Chambers way, which I also really like, but is more like utopia in the face of destruction, which I found really interesting and compelling. And then even the antagonists, like this series has a really good way of making the antagonists be understandable. You see where they're coming from, you see how they've gotten to these conclusions. There's a little bit of having to work with a former antagonist in this story, which I always really like that dynamic when that pops up in stories. And yeah, overall just really dig all these like characters, their character interactions, this kind of like, there's some found family elements-ish, but also their individual arcs and things and how those things tie up. Really at the core of this, besides the like fantasy science bits, there's also the fact that like this thematically revolves around like relationships and like family units and grief and things. Like it tackles a lot of themes without it feeling too heavy. So with that, let me go into the plot. I enjoyed this like front to back. I enjoy the different elements, again, of learning things. There's a sense of risk and loss here that I really appreciate for finales. I've talked about that before, that sometimes I feel like finales don't quite get that element of there are world-ending things going on, especially with this. There's very much like, again, science-y based destruction stuff happening, and you have to have some risk, some loss, things like that. And you have loss in here, not even just in the traditional way of like someone dies or whatever, but like other types of loss and sacrifice and things, which again, I think is super well done. And even the end, I think the ending was a little, I don't necessarily think the ending is weak. Like there's things that tie up so beautifully with the end, and there's a little part at the end where it's almost that like sort of epilogue of we're wrapping everything up and maybe a lot of time is passing and we're kind of seeing something to get to this inevitable conclusion. So I kind of liked how everything sort of gets sorted in that way, but again, in a way that feels fairly satisfying. Again, there's still some loss and some sacrifice, and it's not just easy, but there are some parts at the very end that get very cerebral that people are probably going to be like, but I thought kind of worked for the story. And yeah, overall, I really loved this. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. This whole series, I always forget how much I love it, and then I get back into it and I'm in it again, and it's so good. This is a series that I would definitely reread. I think the way that it expands over each book, where you think that you're getting one kind of story and then you get a very different one, but in a way that's very satisfying. Love that. So comment down below, let me know what you thought of Locklands. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.